to indicate that we have our ARIN registration services help desk here at the meeting, which is outside the meeting room to your left as we go outside. And the help desk will be able to assist with any kind of our registration services. We'll be here through noon on Friday, right? So if anyone needs to get any help, we have our ARIN team right outside. All right, so this is our last session for the day. A nuts and bolts look into the ARIN 41 and Caribnog 15 meeting network. And this is just to give us an insight into the infrastructure and the setup of the network that we have here. Usually have some really good insights into infrastructure at these meetings when we have the network engineering team on site to explain. And so I'm going to ask Frankie and team to come up. So this session will be delivered by David Jeffers and Frankie McDonald. David, Frankie. So, thank you, guys.
Hello, everyone. I'm David Jeffers. I'm the System Administrator with ARIN. As I'm sure many of you know, we run a public policy network or a public policy meeting a couple times a year, and for a lot of them we set up a network to ensure robust connectivity the whole time. This is roughly a timeline for how we can keep that going optimistically and without taking too much of our operations time. So about 1 year out, our Communication and Member Services Department has 2 meeting planners that work with a bunch of network sponsors, or look to find some network sponsors and hotels, and try to take that number down to what's going to work best for an ARIN meeting. And those locations cover, or attempt to cover, all the various regions that are part of ARIN's area. So Canada, United States, parts of the Caribbean. And to really provide the best type of service, we need to find a network sponsor that can provide us with the type of connection that we need. So something that's going to provide enough bandwidth, whether it's going to have V4 and V6 connectivity, or if we're going to have to do something else to make that work properly, and if they're able to announce our space appropriately. So once we find a few locations to look at, we go to do a site visit, and that's typically a few hotels that we look at, and we go meet there with the hotel IT staff. We meet with the network sponsors staff or someone representing them, and go through the hotel, see if it's going to have the right connectivity with ports in the walls, and see what kind of interference we might see with the access points that exist already, and if it's going to actually serve appropriately as a meeting location. So once we identify which location we're going to go with, which network sponsor is going to work for us, then we work with our legal department and the meeting planners to get a contract signed and start the ball rolling a little more. 8 months out, we review the circuit requirements, and that involves a few things. So making sure that the upstream providers will properly see the announcements that we're providing them. The circuit has to be provisioned, so not all the hotels will have the fiber from the network sponsor already in place. So sometimes that requires actually installing that circuit. A lot of times it's already there, but it depends on the hotel. There's a little bit of coordination that goes on with the hotel. We have to know what kind of access points are present in the meeting rooms already, whether or not we can turn them off, or if we can adjust the spectrum a little bit to more properly work with our own access points. We have to confirm the V4 and V6 presence. And again, sometimes that doesn't always work out with V6, especially in the Caribbean. So what we'll do is do a tunnel with our network equipment getting back into the office. and we confirm the announcement space with the network provider. We do provide our own net block, as I said earlier. It's a V4/20 and a V6/48, and we do share that network space with Nanog, and we rotate that because we have numerous meetings a year, and Nanog has numerous meetings a year. We have to make sure that the individual providers can broadcast that space at the right time, and to do that we have to prepare a letter of authorization. 1 month out, we, in the office, prepare the network equipment. It's mostly our network engineers that prepare the routers and switches and make sure that they're ready to send out the first batch, which is something that we then go on site to install. And from that 1 month up to the meeting, we actually do some remote circuit testing. We have a cron job that runs that just send out a whole bunch of traffic. We track to make sure that there's no weird connectivity problems, no power outages, things along those lines. We check that the announcement is actually up from the network sponsor through the looking glass. I think I went too far. Oh, and then the beyond that 1 month out initial setup, we have a second set of equipment. Sorry, this is the circuit testing that we perform. There we go. So about 2 months before the meeting, we have a bunch of other equipment that has to be upgraded or have the latest firmware installed, things like that. So all of our switches, that's again done mostly by our network engineers. And we have the access points that we have staged throughout the meeting space that all have to get upgraded. And we have various other things to support the projector laptops here that hold the presentations. We have the registration laptops that help everybody get registered, and several printers. And that second shipment goes out with times that we are given by our meeting planners, and that gets sent out shortly before the meeting. And then once we're on site, we get everything set up. Sometimes we encounter a few setup problems, things like the wall ports are not actually properly configured, or the switch that we plugged it into is not actually giving it to the room that's expected. So we iron out those details as much as possible, and because we are out there a few days ahead of time, it gives us time to request any new gear that we need or get any new cables that need to be set up ahead of time. It's a three-member team to set up the network, just 3 members of the operations staff. Once we have everything installed and set up, we set up some monitoring in place that will page us at any time of day or night, that will notify us if any of the access points go down, if there's a switch that's having problems, if something's overheating because it's in a really hot closet, anything along those lines. And we set up all the other peripherals, like I mentioned, the registration laptops, projector laptops, etc. And we work with the streaming provider to make sure that the feeds and streaming sources are working well, that people can hear us remotely, and we ensure that any sort of problems with power are addressed. So if we're in a place that's not going to have very smooth and consistent power, we may have to get some sort of uninterrupted power supply. And yeah. And hand it over to Frankie for the wireless setup.
Thank you, David. Set up here for a second. So, hello everyone. I'm Frankie McDonough. I've been with ARIN for 6 years, and I've done 6 meetings. Actually, I've done more meetings than that, but I've set up 6 networks. And recently we started talking about having to do the setups. One of the other Caribnog meetings, we talked about that, I think, in Jamaica, yeah. So I'm going to start off real quick before I jump into the wireless setup, and I'll come back around to this. You notice this container that I have right here. It actually has my cell phone in it, and it's inside of a Faraday cage. So like I said, we'll come back to the lessons learned and why my cell phone is in a Faraday cage, and it has everything to do with presenting with these network slides and presentations. So let's get into the slides. So the wireless setup. So you can't just come in and set down a wireless Verizon MiFi and have it provide network connectivity to everyone. You have to come in and you have to plan everything out. You have to figure out what you're going to do. So what's involved with setting up the wireless? Well, you've got this physical site layout, and different sites have different challenges, right? Sometimes you're in a building that is completely flat. And sometimes you're in a high-rise building and you have different meetings on different floors, and that's always fun. That's kind of a challenge. And then sometimes the rooms get moved where you're going to have it. So all of a sudden you're taking a wireless access point, you're trying to take it over to another room where you previously weren't worried about the cross-connect, and trying to figure out how to cross-connect that at the last second. Things happen. You have to be flexible. So then you have the spectrum considerations, and we'll get into that. I'll show you a heat map of this location, and then we'll talk a little bit about monitoring. So actually, I was just talking about this. This setup that you see here is actually from the meeting that we had in Jamaica, and you can see that we have different fiber runs going from different buildings and across the entire campus, and it was quite challenging because normally we have everything in the same building. It's on different floors, and they have IDFs and MDFs, and you can cross-connect and everything's somewhat simple. But then all of a sudden you're talking about running or using fiber that's already run between different buildings and throwing switches into different buildings, and that gets challenging. One of the things somebody said to me the other evening was, we were talking about setting up the wireless network, and they were talking about how they've spoken with people that are setting up wireless networks at universities or in places where they control everything. And they can just do a heat map. They can put their access points in there, and they think they're very successful at this, and they are. They are very successful. However, when you're doing an ad hoc network for a month, that makes it quite difficult to come back around and try to figure everything out at the last second. And it's not quite as easy as throwing it up in your house or going to a university and setting it up where you basically don't have any other interference. Let's see what we got here. So here's the layout for Miami here. As you can see, we're in Symphony Ballroom 1 and 2. However, when we were here, down at the bottom, you can see concerto ballrooms. We were using all of those. Over to the left, you can see we were using Metronome, but we were using Symphony Ballroom 1 and Symphony Ballroom 2. We were not using 3 and 4. So then we also had the Overture Foyer, and we were using Degas, and alto and tenor we were also using. So everything was on one floor. However, interestingly enough, to cross-connect to this particular room, you've got ports in the back of this room and you've got ports in the front of this room. And the ports in the back of the room actually cross-connect to a different floor entirely. So, and you actually have to go through the IDF to a telco room. So we ended up having to put a switch on a different floor to be able to cross-connect to ports in the same room, which was a little bit challenging, but it worked out. So we were talking about being in the university and not having any interference, right? So in a perfect world, you could sit here and you could look at the non-overlapping channels for 5 gigahertz or the 2.4 gigahertz, and everything would just work. You'd just basically put the access points on the different channels, and you'd be good to go, right? Well, that's not reality. You come into any particular place these days, and you're going to have about 20 different wireless networks, especially in a hotel. So this was a screenshot of all the channels that were being used when we first showed up. And as you can see, there's a lot of channels being used, and there's a lot of ones that overlap. Pretty much every single one, I think, except for one, had overlapping signals. So what we did actually was we went and we asked the hotel, hey, can you turn off your wireless access points? And in some places that we go, that's actually not quite a problem. So they turn them off, and we're usually pretty good to go. However, here at this particular meeting, they had other events going on a couple rooms down, and they couldn't turn them off for us. So you just have to deal with it. So that's what you got. They're doing business, and we're trying to run a meeting, so you just deal with it. So one of the ways we deal with it is we have a visual RF, and we have a thing called Airwave, and it sets up the heat map for us. And you can see that this is a live shot from Monday, and you can see that you have all the different laptops and iPhones and what our coverage was in the area. So that was interesting every time we set that up. And as you're watching this live, it's kind of interesting because you can actually watch the devices kind of disassociate, I think, and reassociate with another access point as people are moving around from breakfast and into the meetings in the morning for the ARIN 41 meeting. So, well, I think I'm getting ahead of myself. Yeah, okay, right about track. So wireless setup, users are not the canaries in the coal mine. One of the worst things that can happen is having somebody complain and say, hey, my internet access isn't working and I'm sitting over here and all of a sudden it just turned off. I want to know before the user knows. I want to have monitoring. That's exceptionally important. So we used to run monitoring internal on our equipment that was here, and we found that could be a problem because one of the things we're doing, and I'll get into that here in a couple of slides, is we're not just monitoring the access points. We have 4 servers that we bring down with us, and we have 2 routers, and we have 4 switches. And we have 4 managed switches, and we have 3 unmanaged switches. And that's a lot of stuff to monitor. And what happens when the internet connection goes down and you're not getting the pages to your phone and you don't know it and users are coming up to you and saying, my internet's not working? Well, you have to have monitoring. So we switched to a third-party external monitoring solution that specializes in this type of thing, and that was pretty good. But on top of that, you also have to monitor, hey, what's going on with my access points individually? You have to say, how many people do I have on this access point in the back room over there? Well, the access point 1 in the back room over there behind Mark tends to have the majority of the load on it. So you have to manage that, and you have to make sure that the load is evenly distributed in this main hall. I think at one point we reached a little bit over 200 devices. Now, over 200 devices isn't a lot. I think one of these access points can handle well over 200. However, we have the power down a little bit so we don't overlap everything and we don't have as much congestion in the area. And that basically, when we do that, we want to keep the users, we found somewhere around 60 per access point, just to be safe. It can go above 60 up to, I think we've had them up to like 120 per access point at one point. Not at this meeting, but at a previous one. But you try to spread the load as much as possible so you don't run into big problems. Let's see, where are we going? Here we go. This is exactly what I was talking about. So right there you can see, I'm not sure how well you can see it, but access point 2 is showing high utilization, low noise, and low errors. And so you can also see under the usage trends that we have about 170 clients connecting across all of the access points. And on the left you can see all the different devices connecting across the access points. Interestingly enough, I thought that the by device type was interesting, OS X being at the top and iPhone being second to that. So a lot of people have OS X and iPhones connecting to the network. So here's a snapshot of the network throughput. As you can see, David talked about earlier about how we run a cron job, and that cron job runs a iPerf test depending on where we're at, or we run a speed test using speed test CLI if you're interested. And every 15 minutes we hit it and we try to max out the network. Interestingly enough, we ended up backing that off a little bit because the network requirements for running these meetings is usually around 100 megabits per second. However, the network that we have provisioned from WebPass, they seem to be capping us at somewhere around 800 megabits per second and 700 megabits per second up. So yeah, 800 down and 700 up, and that's well beyond what we needed. So we were kind of nice to the network and decided to tone it down just a little bit so we didn't max it out. As you can see throughout the days, we end up having different spikes, and that's usually as files are getting uploaded from users sitting around, I don't know, uploading their pictures. I think somebody told me they were uploading all their pictures and it went like that. So before I get on to the lessons learned, let me make sure I didn't miss anything. Yes. One of the things I wanted to mention was this isn't just David and myself and Pete, who's in the back of the room over there. We have a couple of network engineers back at the office, George Anderson and Michael O'Neill. They help a lot with the setup as well, so we kind of distribute it as a team. The network engineers are available to us through the weekend and in the evenings and during the meeting if we need them, and that's kind of nice to have backup. They can sit back away from any chaos that might be happening and really be able to dig into it back at the office. So that's nice. Additionally, we have a security engineer, Steve Scally, that looks into things for us just to ensure nobody's getting into any of our systems and that we've configured everything pretty safe. And let's see. Yes. The other thing is it's not just the wireless network. I mean, I'm talking about the wireless network, but we had some stream, we had about 2 different streams going out the entire time, going out to, I believe our Cascadian had a stream going out to their servers, and I think they were also streaming out to Google. So you had to worry about that, and that was, they were directly plugged into the network. It wasn't over Wi-Fi, so that we didn't overload one of the access points, and that was it's something you have to pay attention to so that you're also not overloading the network. This particular meeting, like I said, the speeds were so great that we weren't really worried about that. But when we're, let's say, operating somewhere in the Caribbean or in a sponsor that really honors the 100 megabits per second, sometimes we run into that problem. So let's see. I think that's it as far as my notes. So at the end, I like to go over lessons learned. What have we learned over different networks that we've set up? We've learned that you need to bring your test kits because you never know what you're going to end up having to tone out, and that is very, very time consuming to sit there and tone each line out. We ended up having to do that this time. The hotel helped us out since it was their infrastructure, but you have to sit around and you have to tone it out because without the connection working, you're dead in the water. So when we go out on the site visits that David was talking about, one of the most important things to do is, so you have to imagine this is a year out, right? It's 1 year out from when you're really trying to get into the meeting. So it's really kind of hard to remember what you did a year ago and what the ports in the room look like and what the IDF looked like. So take a lot of pictures. I did one meeting where I didn't take enough pictures, and that ended up causing us to have a lot more questions than we have for previous meetings. Additional to that is write up the network plan on site, because as soon as you leave on site when you're there and you don't write it up, you're not going to remember every little detail. So David and I recently went on a couple of site visits, and we just sit down and we just write it all out. And I think that was the lessons learned maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and that's a good one. Always start earlier than later, specifically with the LOA and speaking with your sponsors. A lot of times people will want to wait until the last second, and then everybody's rushing, and that's no fun. We dealt with some vendor licensing issues with updating our access points, where we couldn't get in to get the updates and the firmware updates. That was a problem, and as it says, installs may not go as planned. So every meeting is different, and that's obvious. But what you have to think about is you have to think about, okay, what's different about this, and let's apply that information to the firewalls and to the remote monitoring. Let's see what kind of challenges are we going to have. Let's think about this ahead of time before we get down there, because once you get down there, things start flying. It goes real fast, and all of a sudden you're wondering, well, did I get this done? Did I get that done? And you really want to make sure that you reevaluate for each meeting. Be flexible, as I said earlier. And also what I talked about was disabling the hotel access points when and where you can so that you don't have the RF overlap. So, so I think what I have with the slides, the last thing I was going to talk about, and this goes into the lessons learned part, was earlier I talked about putting my phone in the Faraday cage, right? So the last Caribnog that I was at, I think in Jamaica, I gave a very similar talk on this. And what I found out was that my coworkers were texting me and paging me during the presentation, and my phone was on vibrate, and it was sitting up here, and you could hear the buzzing and the beeping, and I was trying to get it turned off and everything. But it did teach me a lesson. The lesson was, yeah, okay, you can turn your phone off. What happens if you think it's off and it's not off or vibrating? So I ended up getting a little Faraday cage for $10 off of Amazon. And during this whole presentation when I've been speaking, all of my coworkers back at the office have been text messaging me and paging me and calling me on the phone, and nothing's gotten through. So it was a good test for the Faraday cage. So is it? Yeah. Does anybody have any questions for David and I?
any questions, could you come up to the mic?
David Farmer, University of Minnesota. So a couple quickies. One, you use ARIN meeting address space that you share with Anon. Do you use your own ASN?
We don't. I believe we don't.
Okay. So then do you change your routing entries to associate the meeting networks with the ASNs so that, because I didn't see anything talking about sort of that as your sort of pre-prep stuff.
I think Mark wants to answer this.
Yeah, earlier in the presentation, you saw this thing about an LOA, right? So we have the sponsor network, the network sponsor actually originate the network. So it changes. We're not peering with them. And I don't think we've done that since I've been at ARIN. So all this stuff is done through a LOA. Actually, we've had cases where we had to, in fact, right before this network, we actually had to call or talk to the previous sponsor of space and say, hey, can you release the announcement. So there's always a little bit of cleanup that has to occur after the fact.
Okay. Well, and what I was asking, are you putting in IRR entries for it?
We didn't do that.
Not setting a very good example.
Sounds like a good lessons learned.
Then the other question I had is, what do you guys use for DHCP on the local net?
We have a FreeBSD box that's running just DHCP. I don't remember if it's the ISC DHCP or not,
Okay.
but it's
He's
just a
saying
FreeBSD node. Yes,
Okay.
so saying yes, ISC DHCP on a FreeBSD node.
Okay, so then you're not using like DHCP to harvest a little bit of information and help you tell you what the users are what desktops and stuff, and to help you find the users and stuff like that?
We aren't using any data for that. That
Okay.
hasn't occurred to us.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Get in the back.
Hi, Michelle Goberdon, Packet Clearinghouse. Firstly, I run a fair amount of knocks at these meetings, so I got to say thank you for the day that I've been here. The Wi-Fi has been awesome, so well done. But my question is around the Wi-Fi, actually. I noticed that your SSID is open. You don't have any kind of WPA2 or anything on that. Are you not worried about any kind of fire sheep type attacks? Is that not something that has occurred to you to want to protect against?
That's a good question. So I believe we've gone back and forth a couple of times on whether or not we wanted to put a password or a passphrase or do WPA, WPA2, and we haven't done it. We keep on talking about it. That decision, I think, ultimately ends up coming down to Mark, and I'm not sure what the reasons were that we kept it open. It's been like this for a while now. I think it's just something maybe we've stuck with. We have talked about it though, so I don't really have a good answer for you unless Mark has something to add to that. No.
So, I guess where I was going with this is one of the problems we've had doing meetings at different fora is the load that WPA2 puts on the AP. When you were talking about the limit of about 200 odd devices on the Aruba kit, I think I saw.
It's Aruba.
I wanted to know if there was a problem that you had experienced with it. But I guess you haven't tried. Okay.
No,
Thank
we
you.
haven't tried. Thank you. I think was there a question online? Okay. Yeah, okay. So the online comment from Donovan Smith, and the question is, optimization techniques would you recommend in this configuration as it relates to channel utilization? Would you recommend sharing load across varying RF channels? Okay, so let me think about this question for a second. So yeah, okay, that's a good question. You can share it across, yeah, so we do share it across our RF channels, the load and everything. So different access points are on different channels within this room specifically. I think one of the slides I had, we swapped over, sorry about that. One of the slides I had showed that we did have our ARIN meeting across different channels. I believe that's what the question is, unless I'm not understanding it correctly. But that is one of the things that we do, and I think that's pretty normal. We wouldn't throw everything on the same channel.
Yeah, that's what he's asking.
That's fine. Okay. As far as optimization techniques, I think it was almost a two-part question. Going through, so on my cell phone when it's not in a Faraday cage, I have an Android phone, and there's a free application called Wi-Fi Analyzer, and we pull it out, and sometimes we walk around and we try to figure out, okay, can a cell phone, it kind of has a weaker receiver than say your laptop, can it get good reception here? And that's one of the ways we just walk around and say, can the end user get the internet access that they need from where they're standing or sitting? And then a little bit later, depending on the outlying meeting space, we'll go and we'll take a laptop into like Metronome over there as an example. We had to move one of the access points around to the other side of a pillar just so that that room could get good enough speeds so that anybody that wanted to go in there and sit, and I think it's a breakout room, could talk and potentially do a video call if they wanted with somebody else or whatever they needed to do. And that's one of the best ways really at the end of the day to test everything is to just walk around and test it yourself. You can't really cheat the hard work.
Well, before I have a quick follow-up question from Donovan Smith. He's asking, what is the manufacturer used in your wireless deployments?
So we use Aruba 225s, and I believe those are now owned by HP. I think HP owns them, but they're Aruba 225s. Oh, okay.
Okay, Jerry George. We sometimes have events, the local ICT association, and they're nowhere as large as an ARIN event. How would we get to convince the hotel staff to turn off their Wi-Fi equipment in situations like that?
So, that's a good question, and a lot of times we do have conversations with the hotel staff, and ultimately what it comes down to is in our contract that we have with the hotel and with their IT team, it specifically states in there that in the case that we can't get our network to work, that they will work with us. We don't just go in and start pulling access points out of the switch. We work with the hotel, and a lot of times they're already aware of this. We don't surprise them. We talk about it. It's in plain English in the contract, and everyone usually has a copy of that.
Would there ever be a consideration to maybe add the hotel's SSID on your equipment just so that they would continue to have coverage within that area if they were needing to turn off equipment?
So I think about 6 years ago now, I think we were in Vancouver, and we had a situation where we couldn't get our network to work properly, I believe. I knew that was my first meeting, and that often comes up, can we take over the hotel's network? And a lot of times when we come in, the hotel's IT staff says, yeah, we can support you. And then we say IPv6. And then they say, what's that? And so that starts the conversation of, well, can we use their infrastructure, and or should we bring in our own equipment? Inevitably, we always end up having to bring in our own equipment. Now, part of that is, well, can we go ahead and adopt some of their switches and routers and any of the infrastructure that they have? The problem usually is, not always, but usually is that they are managed switches that they have, and that kind of segments a part of the network that we no longer have control over. So we end up having to troubleshoot things. We really don't want to have to go and get somebody else to give us access to their infrastructure.
A quick note. So you asked a little more specifically about how a small organization can convince a hotel to change their equipment. Probably not as easily as it would with a larger organization like ARIN. So one thing that we did to really work with the hotel IT staff was collect a lot of data. We didn't approach them saying, hey, can you please turn off these APs? We went around with the application that Frankie was talking about earlier and collected data. We were able to compare when we had just no APs of ours up and just theirs, and took that data, took a screenshot, and I took some other numbers down, and did the same thing once we had our APs up. So we were able to look at the rooms that we had specifically reserved, see where the interference was, and then took it back to the hotel staff and said, hey, look, this is where it's causing a problem. Can you work with us? These are the meetings the meeting spaces that are particularly impacted by your APs, and you're not using those APs right now. They're our meeting space right now. So if you come in just with data, work with them as he said, it's typically not too big of a problem.
Hi, Frankie and David. Claire Craig, Caribnog. This is not a question, but a comment. I'm always I always like to hear your presentations. And my comment has nothing much to do with the technology itself. But what I heard from this conversation was that when an ARIN meeting is planned, one of the key decisions that has to be made is whether the network can support the meeting. And Stephen started this meeting today talking about the importance of the network resilience for the Caribbean. And so it seems to me that, the work that ARIN is doing in the Caribbean is even more important now, because if we're talking about ICT for development, if we don't have networks that can support some of these kinds of meetings, and we're going to be having more of these kinds of things, then it means that we are not going to be getting the kind of business that we need in the Caribbean. So continue to have these conversations, continue to talk to hotels and let them know that this is important, because we are actually turning away business. Because if you are not bringing your business to the Caribbean, because if you all say to Susan and Mark that we can't go there because the network would not support what we want to do, then you're going to have to look for a new location to have it done. So thanks for sharing this information.
Thank you. Front microphone. Oh, go ahead. Mark?
Albert and then Mark, and then we're closing the mics.
Albert Daniels, St. Lucia. We do a lot of outreach in the Caribbean at different events across the Caribbean, and sometimes you suffer from the effectiveness of your marketing or your promotion team, and you get all sorts of people in the room, some perhaps a little bit more sophisticated than you might have expected. White hats, black hats, law enforcement, and the opposite of law enforcement. So my question to you is, what is perhaps, as much as you can say, one of the toughest situations that you've had to deal with in the middle of a meeting related to this whole issue of, and I see certain smiles and body language coming from Stephen. I think he remembers something that happened at a Caribnog meeting. But what's one of the toughest challenges that you've had to deal with in the middle of the meeting, from the perspective of, what we can do to, deal with those kinds of things when they come up?
Okay, so I don't think I was present at this meeting, but one of the meetings that we ran, we had, I don't recall the details, but somebody was basically running a lab off their laptop, and all of the traffic started basically getting routed into their laptop, if I recall correctly. So that was pretty difficult. If I remember correctly, somebody had to get up on stage and ask everyone to check their machines, and somebody turned it off. But to your point, something like that, where that was just somebody innocently running a lab, you're right, somebody could have sat there and just sat and done it the whole day, and that would have been a problem for everyone.
Deliberate DDoS attack from the room, have you had that?
No, not that I'm aware of. Yeah.
To sort of add on to Frankie's sort of comments, one of our favorite network issues that we had was in Chicago.
Yeah.
So Chicago, we had these tremendous spikes in the morning that totally maxed the bandwidth capacity out, and we had no idea where it was coming from. And one of the things that it also did is, consequently, the sponsoring network at that point decided to tamp us down and saying, something's bad going on here, so we're going to shut your access. And so the meeting started, and this was right after a spike, and we had no network. So that was kind of rough, and we went back and finally got things taken care of. It was better the next day, but again, we had a spike. And the spike was, to this day, unknown. The meeting networks are open not only to all the people who are part of the meetings, but they're, in this particular case, it was also to the general public. So someone could have just come in and actually gone ahead and used it. The reason I came up here was to sort of address something that Mr. Farmer talked about earlier about registering the IRR. And I wanted to state a little bit more because I talked to the routing guys in the meantime. For this meeting, we haven't, and we're actually going to add this in to the future. We have in the past, and it's all based on the policies that the upstream or the sponsoring network has put in place that we need to do for their requirements. Some, after you put it into their IRR, their local one. Others in someone like ARIN's, for example. But we will try to address that in a better way in the future. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Mark. And last comment from
This is a non-technical question, but I was in Jamaica. Did the weather play any part going into out of the heat into the cold in terms of setting up the networks?
So specifically at that meeting in Jamaica, one of the things that we were lucky about was that the rooms that they typically had their telco equipment in had air conditioning units in. But interestingly enough, one of the challenges that we did have was that we had, somebody had mentioned to us that, that occasionally there are power blips while we're down there, some for weather related reasons and potentially for just general maintenance and work like anywhere else you'd have. And so one of the ways that we tried to combat that was we actually had UPSs. I think David mentioned that earlier. And we hooked up the UPSs to all the critical equipment so that if everything went down, we'd have, I think it was something around 30 minutes that we could keep the live stream up, we could keep the internet up, even though there would be no lights in the room. Those are the important things, right? The internet goes down, everybody panics, the lights can go out, it's fine. So that's one of the that was one of the things we were worried about there, and it kind of is what you're talking about. One of the things David wanted us to mention, though, was we talked about tunneling V6 in, and sometimes with sponsors we do have to tunnel V6 in. This particular case, we have WebPass, and WebPass does provide us with native V6, which is very nice.
All right, the absolute last comment. Nigel.
Yes, Nigel Castanier from the CTU. We the CTU also run meetings with remote participation and that sort of thing. The challenge we have tends to be more with the audio in terms of avoiding feedback while making sure that remote participants can hear individuals from the room and back and forth and that sort of thing. Is there any, do you all have that sort of facility in the meetings that you set up where you have maybe remote presenters who need to interface with individuals in the room, and is there any special challenge you'll face with respect to getting the audio right for that?
So we typically haven't done remote participation in that regard where somebody might be up on the screen giving video. And as far as the audio, David and I haven't really worked on any of the audio.
So one thing that we do have during the meetings is we have staff back at the office and staff within the hotel but in a different room that are actually live monitoring the feed. So instead of just us relying on, well, maybe we'll get a user report, we want to avoid that. We want the staff to know ahead of time so we don't get user reports of that. We want to be able to adjust it before it's actually a problem for someone else. So we have staff actively, I won't say pestering us, letting us know that there are some sort of audio problems. It's low or it's a little too loud. And so we get that information to our sound provider as soon as possible. Like you said, we don't really interface with that directly, but the sooner we can get the information to the contractor for that, the better.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
So I want to thank Frankie and David for that. It's really great insight into the network operations here, and some good lessons and takeaways. Excellent. I think this was a really great day one with some good dialogue and getting right into the issues which are of import to us. So I want to thank our attendees in the room and online for your participation today. and look forward to continuing the conversation tomorrow and Friday. So, and finally, also thank again our meeting sponsor, ARIN, and our partners for being with us here at Caribnog 15. So thanks, everyone. And just as a closing announcement, I want to do this is a cool part, guys. I want to do a group pic with all of you right as we close off today, and also some photos with our partners and the various RIR teams. So if we can ask you all to, okay, what's that? Okay, yeah, so going to get some direction coming in the next few seconds or so, but just to put everyone on notice so you can hit send on that email and start to assemble so that we can take some pics. All right, so have a good evening, everyone.